So welcome along to the next part of the course. Hopefully by now you've had a chance to look at the pre-scene and go through it in some detail. We're moving on now to the industry component, and we're going to look at the real world auto manufacturing industry, and hopefully this will allow us to shed some light on the pre-scene and put you in a better position to anticipate some of the topics that might come up in the exam in August. Okay, so let's get into it. Before I go straight to the detail, let me just give you an overview of the contents, what we'll be covering. In the first section, we're going to just do a brief intro to the company in the pre-scene, give a little bit of background, go through the main points, and compare this company then with what might be a real-world equivalent, and that you can go and look into in more detail in your own time if you wish to do so. We'll also be coming back to that company at various points in this analysis. In the second section then, we're going to look at the real-world trends in terms of growth, sales, and so on over the last few years. And we'll also look at some projections into the coming years about what's going to happen in this industry in terms of sales, revenue, and so on. We're also going to look at some interesting changes recently in the supply side, some disruptions that have occurred in that area, and some of the changes that are likely to occur in the coming years. Section 3 then will look at the manufacturing process, a very, very important part of this industry. Lots of innovations came from the manufacturing process in the car manufacturing industry. We're going to look in particular at the just-in-time idea. We're going to look at quality circles, which are mentioned in the pre-scene as well, and also at robotics, which is absolutely essential. In section 4 then, we're going to move to new fuel technologies. We're going to be looking at electric cars and batteries, and also hydrogen fuel cells in some detail. We're going to be looking at some of the challenges that are faced by auto manufacturers in implementing and introducing these innovations. And we're also going to be taking a critical eye at some of these new technologies and questioning whether or not there really are value for money. From there, we're then going to look at the regulations and the government impact on this industry, how the government affects the industry, and the various regulations that are being imposed currently on car manufacturers, and how that is changing the kinds of decisions that are made in terms of investment and how that affects the kind of investments in new technologies. Section 6 then, we're going to focus on the dealership side. We're going to look at the selling of cars and how the nature of the relationship really between car manufacturers and dealerships. It can be quite controversial, can be quite fraught in many ways, and we're going to look at these issues in some detail. And that will bring us then to the end of the industry analysis. So let's begin with the pre-scene company. It's Aurora Automotive, or the Aurora Automotive Group, and it was founded in the first half of the 20th century. We're told that it's based in a European country called Westland, specializes in car manufacture in particular, focused on what's called the mid-market, and it's producing high quality but good value for money automobiles. And of course, one of the most prominent values or mission statements that we see with Aurora Automotive is that they are striving to be environmentally friendly. We see this repeatedly in the values, the corporate values and the staff values. There's a huge focus on environmentalism, on treating the planet well, and so on. We're going to come back to that as we go through this industry analysis. Volkswagen is perhaps a real-world equivalent or a model for the company that we're dealing with in the pre-scene. Volkswagen was likewise founded in the early part of the 20th century in Germany in 1932. It is also maybe, you could say, a mid-market group that are focusing primarily on kind of middle earners, middle income people and consumers. And this is kind of borne out by the fact that their name translates roughly as people's car. It's also considered high quality, but still good value for money. So they have very, very good reputation for quality, reliability, and so on. But also they're considered to be relatively affordable. It's also a group in the same way that Aurora Automotive has many subsidiaries. So too does Volkswagen. It's a Volkswagen group, and Audi, for example, is one of their subsidiaries. Heavy investment in R&D, and we're going to come back to this in the pre-scene. There is an impression given that Aurora is very interested in forward-thinking, forward-looking, especially when it comes to environmental issues, and likewise Volkswagen is very, very heavily invested in research and development and new technologies. So that's enough about the real-world comparison. Let's get straight into the global trends that we're seeing in this industry over the recent years. You can see here we're looking at global new car sales. There's been a fairly modest growth in recent years from 2013 to 2016. You can see here, not particularly spectacular. You can see that in Asia is seeing steady growth, but the other areas are fairly modest, and in some cases you can see declines. For example, in South America there you can see that there's been a fairly gradual decline over the last number of years. In Europe, things are pretty undramatic. Likewise, in North America, you can see there hasn't been particularly dramatic growth. Having said that, of course, North America and Europe are considerable markets for new car sales. Asia is quickly making ground as well and is becoming one of the most important areas, and we'll come back to that in the next few slides. Okay, again here you can see global sales in the last number of years. They have been fairly good, it has to be said. You can see here from, if you're looking back as far as the 1990s, things have improved substantially in terms of number of cars sold worldwide. In some ways this has tracked overall population growth, and you can see in recent years from 2014 to 2017 there has been growth, but it has been, you can see, slowing somewhat in the most recent years. Let's move to the regional trends now. We can look here at China, and China, of course, as in many other industrial segments, is one of the leaders in terms of growth, world growth in recent years. We've seen quite substantial growth in new car sales in China from 2008 to 2017. As you can see here on the right, there's a little segment here. The automobile industry has been a major driving force in China's economic momentum, and despite slowing growth, the Chinese automobile industry is expected to continue fueling the economy. And China was the world's leading car producing country in 2015, producing approximately 21 million passenger cars and claiming a 24.1% of a share of total global vehicle production. So a really, really important player in the global manufacturing industry is China, but also in terms of purchasing and consumer behavior. We're seeing more and more middle income people in China beginning to purchase new cars. There is a growing middle class there, and it is certainly a market that car sellers in the West are going to have to keep a close eye on as they move forward. In Europe then, we see a much more mixed fortune. We can see in recent years, since 2006, it's very much been up and down in terms of new passenger car registrations. Here you can see this is for November, but you can see how variable it is. It's really, really up and down, and there's no real discernible trend here. Things have begun to pick up in recent years again after a number of slow years from 2011, 2012. But really, things are in Europe are almost flat in many ways in the last 5 to 10 years. So not a lot happening in the EU. And there are reasons why that's the case, some having to do with regulation, which we'll be coming back to later on in this presentation. Russia then, again, fairly mixed bag, quite up and down in recent years. You can see here that in the mid-2000s things were going very, very well, and then of course we had the global economic crisis and down it went in 2009. Began to recover again then up until 2012, at which point we saw another decline, and it's kind of flattened out since then. And it's not very clear where Russia is going to go, and of course a lot depends on their economic fortunes. So we're looking here now at forecasts for emerging markets in particular, that is Brazil, Eastern Europe, South Africa, China and India. You can see that a fairly optimistic projection, it has to be said, for Brazil. And perhaps one could say this is a little bit too optimistic, based, if you look at the recent developments in terms of politics and economics in Brazil, things have been very, very disrupted and volatile. So it's hard to rely, to put a great deal of trust in this particular projection. But the others seem to be reasonable enough. You can see Eastern Europe, South Africa and China, based on their recent economic growth, these seem like reasonable projections. And China and India, of course, as you can see on the right here, one of the major growers in the coming years, it's expected. And we should certainly keep an eye on those markets if we are car manufacturers. North America and Europe then, in terms of growth, as you might expect, much less spectacular than the emerging markets. North America, as you can see here, it's projected to be more or less flat for the next 10 years or so. Europe here seeing a little bit of a more optimistic growth trend based on this projection. And this is coming from PricewaterhouseCoopers analysis in 2015. Hard to know whether or not their European projection is a little bit optimistic. Again, this depends a lot on how things grow within the Eurozone. And based on the Brexit situation, it's not altogether clear whether or not it's going to be as consistent as that. So again, North America and Europe, they're major markets in absolute terms, but when it comes to growth, perhaps things are going to be a little bit more modest. Japan and South Korea then are treated separately based on their historical trends, because they've been largely separate in many ways from the rest of Asia. More established, mature economies, and as you can see here, the growth reflects that. We're not seeing an awful lot of growth in the coming years based on these projections in Japan and South Korea. Fairly flat and unspectacular. But again, Japan is a very important country from the point of view of the car manufacturing industry for many reasons, and we're going to come back to some of these later on. Okay, so this is just for those of you who may be a little bit lost when it comes to some of the jargon and technical terms in terms of referring to different car types. I'm just going to very quickly run through this, just in case something comes up in the exam in August, in case any of the vocabulary you're not familiar with it, because there are different ways of referring to the same kinds of cars depending on what region you're in. So I'll just go through this very quickly. We have what's called a city car. These are the tiny little mini cars you'll sometimes see zipping around, usually in urban areas. Then we have the compact car, or the hatchback as it's known, hatchback being more common in Europe, and compact car then perhaps in the United States is a little bit of a common term there. We then have the medium saloon, large saloon, and luxury car. This would be the really high-end cars like, for example, Bentley or Aston Martin would be considered typical luxury cars, or Lamborghini, for example. Then we have the SUV, which is the sports utility vehicle. These are the huge Jeep-like vehicles that you would see mostly, again, in kind of urban, suburban areas. And then you have the people carrier, or what's sometimes known as the multi-purpose vehicle. These are usually family kind of cars for large families. And you have the sports car, of course, Ferraris, as I mentioned, Lamborghini. And then finally you have the pickup truck. So they're just some of the main categories in different ways of referring to the same vehicles in different regions. Now, the market leader in terms of new car sales is consistently Toyota. Toyota is a huge seller of cars internationally, one of the biggest global players. And in 2016, again, it registered a record sales, global car sales, 10.15 million vehicles sold worldwide. So Toyota really is the leader still in many respects globally. And there are good reasons for that, and we're going to come back to this in terms of Toyota's manufacturing process and their innovations and cutting-edge approach to manufacturing, which has been adopted by most other car companies now and leads the way in terms of innovation. Okay, so we're going to look at suppliers. There are a lot of issues pertaining to supply in the car manufacturing industry. It's a really complex supply chain, and there's a lot of things changing at the moment. Very complex, and there's components for a manufacturer. They can come from as many as 100 different outside suppliers. And in the car manufacturing industry, car manufacturers often source from both external and internal suppliers. There's a lot of vertical integration in terms of supplies as well. And you get a lot of inter-company collaboration in terms of offering components and parts to often competing car manufacturers. Some manufacturers have their own subsidiary parts suppliers, as I mentioned. Tesla is one company with a huge amount of vertical integration, 80% according to Goldman Sachs. However, most mainstream marques outsource about 80% of their supply, primarily to suppliers within the manufacturer's country. 50% of BMW suppliers, for example, are located in Germany, and another 35% in other European countries. So you can see car manufacturers, they try to keep their supply chain fairly local, and failing that within at least neighbouring countries. That's the typical way that they work. Now, one of the key changes we've been seeing in recent years in the supply chain is a shift away from steel towards aluminium and plastics. Increasingly, companies are looking to substitute these materials into their manufacturing process. This is due to the incentives that have been put in place from regulations from government, as we'll come back to in later slides, and fuel efficiency requirements especially. Aluminium and plastics are increasingly desirable for this reason, and one of the main reasons is, of course, because aluminium is lighter than steel and it's only slightly more expensive in terms of per unit costs. Eventual compliance and efficiency savings may compensate for the higher initial costs that come from buying aluminium in bulk from suppliers. So even though the per unit cost for aluminium compared to steel is only slightly more expensive, when you're talking about buying huge amounts, buying in bulk, as car manufacturers of course would have to do, those costs can go up quite significantly. But the point, I guess, is that those costs might be compensated for the compliance and efficiency savings that they make by substituting in aluminium as soon as possible, in order to avoid incurring penalties, for example, with failure to comply with emission standards, which we'll come back to in later slides. So as you can see here, based on the recent trends, aluminium continues to grow as a share of vehicles that are being produced and manufactured, and you can see that steel is in steady decline as well. So this really is a trend that needs to be kept an eye on, and certainly car manufacturers are going to be looking to substitute aluminium in for steel as much as possible in the coming years, based on all of the regulations that are being imposed by governments. So you can see here, aluminium's share of the average automotive materials mix in the world is likely to reach 15 to 16% by 2025, up from approximately 9% in 2015. You can see here, large aluminium content increases for body parts, closures and large transmission cases will more than offset small content losses for components in smaller engines, and stiff competition from new AHS steels for suspension control arms in future vehicles. You can see here at the end, it's now possible to make an entire body in white vehicle structure from aluminium, resulting in significant weight reduction and performance increases. So this is the key point here, is the weight reduction and performance increases that are yielded by aluminium despite its slightly higher per unit cost. Another area where we're seeing a lot of supply side disruption is in tech, of course, and this is a very important point in the pre-scene. We're seeing a huge amount of integration of really advanced tech into cars, smart cars, intelligent cars, and of course self-driving technology, which we'll come back to later. We're seeing a huge amount of collaboration between really big tech companies, Google, Apple, and also phone manufacturers and so on. And we're seeing a lot of that technology being integrated now into cars, with connectivity and so on being a huge part of car diagnostics and things like that going forward. So we're going to see a huge amount of that kind of disruption taking place in the coming years. So you can see here in a new report from BI Intelligence, they examined how Silicon Valley and Detroit are waging a war over consumer technology in the car. You can see also Android and iOS here at the end of this passage is being integrated into cars increasingly. And they're going to try and build their own web-ready platforms, and what kinds of apps and services might stand to gain the most from in-car usage. This is a really important area for both car manufacturers and indeed for tech companies as well. There's a lot of potential there to secure really long-term contracts that are mutually beneficial. And so you're going to see a lot of technology companies like Apple, for example, Samsung, and Google indeed, looking to the car industry as a way of investing and expanding their operations and signing really lucrative contracts. As we saw in the pre-scene, this is mentioned that it's certainly a possibility that tech is going to be playing a key role in car manufacturing going forward. So that's something to keep an eye on and to consider from the point of view of changes in suppliers. Okay, we need to take a very close look now at the manufacturing process. This is something that is gone into considerable detail in the pre-scene. So we're going to look at three of the main features, I should say, of the manufacturing process now in this segment. The assembly line method, of course, for mass car manufacturing was pioneered by the Ford company at the beginning of the 20th century. First implemented for its famous Model T in 1913. This was a really revolutionary implementation, this new system of manufacturing, the assembly line method, specialization all the way through the assembly line, different people focusing on very small tasks at each stage, and it reduced the time of production absolutely drastically from an average of 728 minutes per car to an astonishing 93 minutes per car back in the day for the Model T in 1913. And of course the rest of capitalist industry really followed suit after this and tried to replicate the Ford manufacturing philosophy. It slashed production costs, of course, and this allowed cars to be price competitive and allowed them to be sold on the mass market. And so it became something that many people could afford, where before it was considered just a luxury item or a kind of a novelty item. Ford really was the first company that made cars a mass market phenomenon rather than something that was the kind of exclusive luxury of the super rich. Okay, so modern assembly lines then have taken the Ford model and really innovated it in many ways. We're going to be looking at some of these ways now in the next few slides. Virtually all contemporary car manufacturers, of course, use this assembly line process, moving through the various stages with hyper specialization at each stage. Robotics and automation, of course, have replaced a lot of the manual labor and are increasingly the norm for mainstream car manufacturers. Sophistication of modern cars has actually increased the production times since the days of the Model T. This is perhaps not surprising. So despite the fact that we've seen real huge advances in the automation and robotics component of the assembly line process, the sheer sophistication and detail of a modern car has actually increased the average production time. But we're still seeing some very impressive results if you consider just how complex and amazing modern cars are as machines. So for example, one mainstream example, Toyota once again, takes on average just under 20 hours to assemble one car from start to finish. So less than a day to produce a car from the absolute beginning to the end. Really impressive stuff if you think about it, what goes into a car and all of the different components, electronics and all the computer components as well in modern cars. Now, one of the really important points from the pre-scene and one of the really important points in the car manufacturing industry in the real world is this concept of just-in-time manufacturing, or JIT for short. Originated by a car manufacturer in Toyota in its modern form around the 1960s, using what's called the Kanban system to signal to suppliers when new parts are needed and in precise quantities. We're going to look at this in a bit more detail now in the next slide. I'm just giving you a brief overview here of what this JIT, or just-in-time philosophy, is. One of the big benefits of the just-in-time system is that if it's done properly, it reduces inventory substantially, so you don't have to keep as much stock of supplies. And of course, this has many benefits, which we'll come back to. One of the risks, unfortunately, of the JIT system, of course, everything has costs and benefits. One of the potential costs is that any failure or disruption in the supplier's delivery system can bring production to a halt. Whereas if you do have a large inventory, at least if there is a problem with the supplier in terms of their delivery, you have that buffer of a large inventory that you can rely on or depend on for a period of time until the supplier sorts out their delivery system. But in the case of JIT, you are a little bit more vulnerable and exposed to those kinds of failures. However, it has many other upsides, which we're going to look at now. We're going to look at this short video clip here, and this will give you a very good sense of the benefits of the JIT system.
Just-in-time, JIT, is a system of supplying goods as close as possible to when they are actually needed. For a company that resells, this means goods arrive just before hitting the shelves for customer purchase. For a manufacturing company, it means parts and raw materials arrive just before they are added to the final product. Keeping less inventory on hand means a company has more available cash and credit for other uses. JIT requires the constant and precise monitoring of demand. This is done with the use of Kanban, signals between various points of production which can alert when the next part or product is needed. Kanban helps facilitate the continuous objectives of streamlining, efficiency, and improving quality, all of which are key goals of JIT. For retailers, overestimation of demand results in bloated inventories and a reduction in profits due to markdowns. Underestimation results in empty shelves and lost sales. For a manufacturer, underestimation is the main problem. Without necessary materials, production stops and the manufacturer is unable to deliver goods as promised. Just-in-time inventory management is facilitated by electronic inventory systems. These allow a business to better monitor the inventory and respond more rapidly when it gets low. Some just-in-time systems are so good that a product is not even manufactured until the consumer buys it. Prior to these systems, businesses had to keep higher inventories just in case there was an unanticipated spike in demand.